Bueno, buenos días. Pues es realmente para mí un privilegio el poder hacer la presentación de la conferencia que vamos a tener la mañana de hoy y además a nombre del doctor Manuel de Chávez, presidente de la Comisión Nacional de Bioética, darle la bienvenida al doctor David Koespell. Pues antes de iniciar con su plática me voy a permitir hacer una pequeña introducción, muy pequeña en realidad. El doctor es doctor en filosofía y abogado, así como profesor y autor de varios libros. Sus investigaciones entretejen los campos de la ciencia, la tecnología, la ética y las políticas públicas. Es egresado de la Universidad de Nueva York en Buffalo y profesor asociado de la Universidad Tecnológica de Delft en Holanda desde el año 2008. Varias de sus investigaciones se han dado a conocer en medios de comunicación masivos como el Washington Times, la radio pública de los Estados Unidos, Fox News, The Guardian y en la misma televisión local en Holanda. Ha publicado decenas de artículos en temas de ética, propiedad intelectual y su impacto en la tecnología. Es autor de varios libros en ética de la ciencia y la tecnología. Sus publicaciones más recientes son Innovación y Nanotecnología, El fin de la propiedad intelectual y ¿A quién perteneces? El interés corporativo de patentar el genoma humano. Pues creo que es una gran oportunidad para nosotros para interaccionar con alguien que tiene este perfil y estas características que pues no se pueden encontrar tan fácilmente. David, you're welcome. Thank you very much for coming and visiting here with us.
Thank you very much. Lo siento, no hablo bien español. Who here understands English? Okay, so I'll go slowly and I'll offer opportunities to clarify if you need me to clarify anything I mentioned. Some of the discussion is a little bit technical because I'm dealing with some legal terminology as well as scientific terminology. So at any time, just stop me if you need me to clarify. So in 2009, published a book called Who Owns You? And I've given Dr. Kawa a copy that it'll be in the building. You can always reference it if you want. I'm hoping actually it comes out in a second edition now because I'm going to describe to you some very interesting things that have happened since its publication. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of background by way of this important legal case that just resolved in the United States. You may have heard about it, where the ACLU sued a company over patents on some genes. So I will describe that case in more detail. It has to do with what we call the BRCA genes, which are related to occurrences of breast cancer and ovarian cancer. And then I will talk about what I call an a priori theory of the commons. And this relates more generally to the question of what belongs to everybody. And I'm going to lay out a description of what I believe the scientific commons consists of and why the law is now recognizing it in a way that I think is more proper. And then I will give a more philosophical bit at the end, a general theory of ontology of nature versus artifact. And this is interesting and I think important as we move forward and work through future problems relating to scientific discoveries and whether or not they should be patented. So, first let's talk about, these are the three sections. So first let's talk about the gene patents that were the issue in the Myriad case. And I'll refer to the Myriad case because that's the company that was sued. In 1998, a fellow who was both involved in research at the University of Utah and the principal of a company in a sort of private-public partnership that we now are seeing many more of, discovered mutations found to be correlated to an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancers. And he was one of about 15 different research centers throughout the world that were all trying to find these mutations at the same time. His research, as with most of the research on these genes, was largely funded through public grants. Grants that came from, in the United States, the National Institutes for Health, and around the world from other similar granting organizations as well. When they discovered in his research group these mutations, they licensed a patent to Myriad Genetics. There's a pointer on this, I have to figure it out. Is that? No. Was that it? Oh, yeah, okay, but it doesn't work on the screen, so I'll just use my finger. So this is the guy we're talking about mostly. He was in charge of the research at the University of Utah, and it was in partnership with the University of Utah Research Foundation. He gets the patent because he's the inventor of this gene, along with all these others who were involved in the group. They assign that patent to Myriad Genetics, in which he's a founder, a principal, major figure in this corporation, Myriad Genetics. Myriad Genetics and the University of Utah Research Foundation now are the holders of this piece of property. And what does the piece of property describe? We have to look at what a patent is first. So if you're not familiar with what a patent is, they're complex legal documents that describe a monopoly. So in property law, if any of you have here transferred or bought land, you know there's a description of what we call in English the metes and bounds of the land. Basically all the measurements of that land from certain geographical locations. Well, there's a similar thing in a patent that describes the boundaries of your monopoly. A patent grants you a monopoly for a period of time to practice something or to make something. So either to do a certain process or to create a certain thing, a chemical, a machine, etc. And it gives you that monopoly to the exclusion of all others. So nobody else can practice that thing or make that thing, reproduce it, without your permission and without paying you some royalty. Okay? So let's look at this patent in the Myriad case. It describes the metes and bounds of this monopoly as follows. So there's an appendix that includes a genome sequence, right? A nucleotide sequence. That's this nucleotide sequence that they discovered is this mutation that is correlated to a high rate of, or increased risk of cancers. Okay? So, claim 1, an isolated DNA coding for a BRCA polypeptide, said polypeptide having the amino acid sequence set forth in sequence ID number 2. This is a description of that polypeptide sequence. Okay? Not the gene itself, but the polypeptide sequence that is created from the gene. You understand I don't have to describe to you the science, right? So the isolated DNA also is claimed. So not only do they get a claim on the polypeptide, but they also get it for the DNA itself. Okay, yeah?
And also the different DNA sequences that will arise to the same peptide.
Yes, exactly.
That's
So
also possible.
by claiming for the polypeptide,
Yes.
they get a broader claim than just the sequence.
Right.
That's exactly true. But this is good practice if you're getting a patent. You get as much as you can, right? As if you're getting a piece of land, you try to get as much as you can too. So also the isolated DNA, which contains BRCA1, regulatory sequences, and these are all descriptions of isolated, after number 1, they're descriptions of isolated nucleotide sequences, okay? And those sequences are described later in the patent. So, what does that mean? What that means is that since 1998, nobody who wanted to test for the presence of that mutation could do so other than Myriad, in areas where those patents were in effect. It wasn't the case here in Mexico because the Mexican Patent Office rejected Myriad's claim. Or they made it very difficult and eventually Myriad gave up. But it was the case in Europe, where in the EPO the claim was upheld. It's a case in Australia and a number of other places around the world where Myriad basically had a monopoly to test for this sequence. Why is that? Because up until recently, testing means having to reproduce that sequence. Remember that a patent gives you a monopoly on the reproduction of a thing. So by claiming to own or have invented this mutation, right, this sequence of nucleotides, they were able to monopolize and prevent others from making copies of that sequence. And that is the primary method of testing. So, in 2009, the ACLU and a couple of other organizations sued this company, Myriad, as well as the Patent Office, over these patents. And they claimed that under Section 101 of the Patent Act, these patents were not valid, and I'll explain why. So the district court, which is the lowest court in that case, decided that the ACLU was right, and everybody was very surprised. It was a real remarkable decision by a district court. Because the reasoning of the district court was that these nucleotide sequences were natural products. Now, although you can get patents for any new invention or discovery, there are exceptions where they are either natural phenomena, abstract ideas, or laws of nature. Okay? So you can't claim ownership of any of these three things, even if they are new. Nobody's ever described them before. So the court reasoned that the gene sequences that were claimed in those patents were natural products. They were not new. They were excluded, which, as here, oops. Maybe somebody could close that window for me. Oops, there we go. Let's try this. So it fit into one of these exceptions, natural phenomena or products of nature. The isolation and purification argument that has upheld these sorts of patents in the past was deemed to be a lawyer's trick. Now this would have been a major reformulation of the law of patent. Because since about the early 1900s, you've been able to get patents on isolated products of nature. All right. The case that establishes this most clearly was a case involving Park Davis. They had isolated adrenaline in a purified form from adrenal glands of animals. Okay, and it was a useful composition of matter. And they said, well, okay, because you can't find pools of adrenaline lying around, this isolated adrenaline is sufficiently inventive so that we could give a patent. But what the judge, and his name was Judge Sweet, said in this case is that isolation and purification argument is just a lawyer's trick. When we look at something like adrenaline, what we're really looking at is the product of nature. Just as if we look at the gene sequences in the BRCA1 and 2 patents, we're just looking at a product of nature. It's not like anybody made that thing. Well, the Court of Appeals that heard the appeal from this, because Myriad immediately appealed, because actually 86% of their company's profits come from this one patent. And it's now, over the lifetime of the patent, about $2 billion. So it's very valuable to them to defend this patent. They appealed. The appellate court said, no, these are not man-made because nature doesn't produce isolated genes. That was the reasoning. So they upheld the isolation and purification doctrine. Well, the ACLU appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard that case just recently, this year. The Supreme Court, in the meantime, had decided in another case called Prometheus, in which there was a claim on a diagnostic method. Now, this is important. A patent that Prometheus had was on a method of diagnosing by tracking something that occurs with dosing. Okay, so what they claim to have invented was a method of determining a proper dosage by looking at the metabolomics. Okay? The Supreme Court said this is ridiculous. That's not something you invented. You're just looking at something that nature does. Okay? So in Prometheus, the court said, no way is this patentable. This is just a law of nature. And they said, meanwhile, we're not going to listen to the appeal yet in Myriad. We want you, appellate court, to reconsider what you've done in light of our decision in Prometheus. Well, what do you think the appellate court did? The same thing they did in the first instance. They thought they were right. They weren't going to concede to the Supreme Court. There's obviously a little battle going between these two courts. And they upheld themselves, basically. And then the ACLU finally said, well, you got to listen to this case, Supreme Court, and they did. Okay, so that's the legal background. Any questions about what happened? Then I'll tell you the exciting conclusion of that shortly. But are there any questions about that so far? No? Okay. Now, this is a little more probably in line with what you're familiar with. I'm going to describe now a general theory of the scientific commons, and I will relate it to what the Supreme Court ultimately has done in the Myriad case. So, I was interested, when I was looking at the question of whether genes ought to be patentable, about this general notion we have of the commons. And one thing I noticed about theories of the commons is that I thought they were missing something. So I looked historically at what the commons was. And in property law, we can trace the notion of the commons back to when there was a sovereign. Okay, and who owned the land when there were kings and queens? And who owned everything? The king, right? And they got their right to own everything from God. And what they did, though, was because there were some very poor people generally in these places who didn't own anything, who weren't even able to rent land. These people couldn't live without some access to certain parts of the land. So they started creating these things they called commons. And commons of that type was land that was consciously set aside by the sovereign so that some people who came to be called commoners could graze their sheep, raise some vegetables. They could even erect, the law in England was if you could erect a shelter between sunrise and sunset, you could live in it. So that was, again, by the good graces of the sovereign, you could own a little something, or at least have shelter and land and some room to cultivate vegetables. That is a type of commons that we're most familiar with, and I think we should call this a commons by choice. And this is, the reason I call this a commons by choice is because the sovereign didn't have to do this. All right? The sovereign could just say, enclose this space and say nobody may use it. And protect it against, they could put their, sentries there at the gate and say, got to pay a fine or pay a toll in order to use this land, etc. So this is a commons by choice based upon, and this is where I get into my sort of philosophical argument, which is unnecessary for the rest of the debate, but let me describe it to you because I can. I believe that the justice of ownership of things like land or things like this is grounded before law in the fact of excludability. Okay? So your right to sit in that chair, even without a law that says you can sit in it, is grounded in the fact that you are in current possession of it. So in order to dispossess you of what you are in possession of, there's a couple of things that could happen, right? We could agree, we could transfer, or I could shove you out of the chair. So I think why laws exist about property is in order to create some stability and to prevent violence in the transfer of property. Okay? To maintain some confidence that what you own and possess is going to be in your possession. I don't want to debate that. It's unnecessary for the rest of this, but that's my theory of, and I mentioned this guy, Adolf Reinach, who was an Austrian philosopher, lawyer also, who starts to develop this notion, and I think he's onto something. But let's set that aside. Now, let's consider the other sort of commons. There are parts of the universe that are incapable of exclusive possession, regardless of laws. So let's look at that part of the universe. It turns out that among those things are things like laws of nature, products of nature, and abstract ideas. By products of nature, I don't mean the token. So, a tree, right, is a product of nature. But a particular tree could be owned by somebody. What you can't exclusively possess is all of the trees, or any future tree. And I'll explain that shortly as well. And also abstract ideas. So my sense is that all three of these things, which if we'll remember, are excluded by the court from patent monopoly, are also incapable of exclusive possession just a priori, just by nature of the way they exist. So something like this, right? I might be the first to describe this law, but there's no way I can prevent anybody from in any way using it, right? Same is true for, let's say, this product of nature. I think it's safe to say that H2O is a product of nature. If I'm the first to discover its chemical properties, its chemical form, well, under the current law, I might be able to get a patent because I've isolated it. But I think that's insane, and it's contrary to this notion of excludability. So although I might describe it, there's no way I can prevent others from, say, using it, making it, enjoying it. Okay? The same is true as that of abstract ideas. So I might be, the first to describe the idea of courage in a way that makes some sense, but again, I can't exclude anyone from it. So these sorts of things, I think, belong to commons by necessity. Okay? And by necessity, I mean a sort of material or logical necessity. There's simply no way they could not be in the commons. They belong to the world in general, and they cannot be enclosed to the exclusion of anyone. All right? Mm-hmm. That's, I think, a fair description of the scientific commons in general, and how we can start to divide the world among those things that ought to be protectable by patent and those that ought not to be. And that's where I think the courts, until recently, were very wrong in granting patents like the one that Myriad had. Okay, any questions about that theory of the scientific commons? No? Okay. So, now I want to describe what I think the legal ontology is and how we can apply it in a way that makes sense going forward so that we don't end up with monopolies like Myriad's. So I think the law actually recognizes this distinction between the scientific commons and the man-made world of artifacts. And the explicit exclusion I described of laws of nature, abstract ideas, and natural phenomena is a very naive recognition of this distinction. But things have complicated this. And the law, I'm a lawyer as well as a philosopher, and so I recognize the law isn't always that interested in logical precision. It's often more concerned with getting a particular result. But I think that over time, especially in a common law system, more and more logical precision is worked into the law. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with the dynamics of what's happened in patent law and natural products, much to the frustration of patent attorneys everywhere. So what happened is this isolation and purification doctrine and this messy term man-made. Okay, this is the one that really trips up the lawyers who are trying to deal with this. Because I've had debates with people, patent lawyers, some of whom I'm friendly with and some I'm not, in which they're apoplectic. They get very upset when you claim that something man-made, it could somehow be a natural product. So the example I like to use with them is oxygen, O2. So in the late 1700s, I think it was 1794, Joseph Priestley discovered what he called phlogiston, and it turns out to be O2. And he realized that if you heat an amount of mercuric oxide, you get a gas that is highly combustible, and that's also, you can breathe. And that gas we know is O2. He was able to isolate and purify O2 by heating mercuric oxide. Okay? Of course, under the purification doctrine, he would have been able to get a patent for O2. And so far, I can find no patent attorney who thinks there's anything wrong with that. To them, it seems perfectly natural that something which is man-made, and there's no doubt that in the case of heating mercuric oxide, you are creating, man is creating, humans are creating, a collection of O2 molecules that wouldn't exist except for man's action, or human's action. Okay? But, and they argue that, you don't get these quantities of O2 in nature, and therefore it's not really a product of nature. Now that, I think, for non-lawyers, sounds odd. To claim that O2, or any concentration of O2, is not man-made, seems odd. So let's figure out how to deal with this. Isolation of O2 in that example doesn't create something that doesn't occur in nature. What you have is a man-made quantity of a natural product. Okay, and how does that work? Let's look at it. It turns out, I think, there are three types of things in the world, maybe in the universe. There's laws and products of nature. There are synthesized natural products. And there are true artifacts. And I think this ontology, this description of the world, gives us a way to decide what sorts of things ought to be able to be monopolized and what ought not to be. And one that also coincides well with the theory of the scientific commons that I've described. So, how does it work? Laws of nature and products of nature exist without any human intention and without any human design. Okay? So O2, the molecule O2, even though you might create an instance of that molecule through some synthetic process, the manner of its existence is not because of human design. The process of its existence is, but not the form of its particular molecule's existence. You understand? So there's nothing about an O2 molecule that anyone could claim to have been designed by humans. Okay? We might intend to synthesize a particular molecule or group of molecules, but the form of their existence is not a human design. Same is true of the BRCA genes, right? There are genes I could design, and those would then be properly patentable. But If we've merely identified something that exists in nature, then we haven't designed it. Synthesized natural products. So let's now look at the O2 that I've created, or the BRCA genes that I isolate in the lab. Yes, I've put intention into doing that. But again, the manner of their existence, right? The particular nucleotide sequence is not a product of my design. Okay? And then finally, true artifacts. These have both human intention and human design. And I think we can see most of our lives we interact with these all the time. So I don't think they're very complicated to identify. What ought we to do with synthesized natural products? Well, I'd say the manner of synthesis ought to be protectable. That is a human invention. Okay? But the product itself is not. So what would we do with O2? Priestley's method of making O2? Give him a patent for that method. But you can't give him a patent on O2 because he didn't design the molecule. Okay? So there is still a way to protect inventions where there are synthetic natural products or phenomena. You just can't get the natural phenomenon itself. Okay? So this, I think, is a workable ontology. I think it's reflected in what the Supreme Court is now doing, and I now can reveal to you that the Supreme Court, back in April, did something remarkable. Or actually it was May, sorry. They held that the BRCA1 and 2 genes were not patent eligible because they were products of nature. So Myriad is now trying to find a way to protect the bulk of their company's profitability. And they're suing still. So they're suing on the other parts of their patents. We'll see what happens. So we can answer questions as to whether things should be patentable by looking at the question of whether they have both intention and design. In the case of O2, O2 would exist, so the question I raise here is, but for the design and intention of a human, would the thing exist? If yes, then no patent. So, but for the design of intention of humans, O2 exists all over the place.
Yes.
But for the design and intention of humans, unmodified gene sequences exist. But for the design and intention of humans, methods or processes of identifying genes don't exist. So these are properly patentable. And so, yeah.
What happens when the intention is after?
That's an interesting problem. So sometimes we discover things by accident, right? But as soon as you decide to turn it into a technology, then you've got an intention to make it utilitarian. So then I think you've got something you could patent. Okay? But yeah, there's accidents all the time that people don't recognize and don't try to monopolize.
Yes, that when the people recognize, but after?
That's fine. So if I stumble across this gene, right, that exists in nature, or I stumble accidentally, I accidentally heat a quantity of mercuric oxide, right, I have an explosion or something. What I want to do is now turn it into something utilitarian, and now I've got an intention to make a product, some technology. So as soon as you've got an intention to turn something discovered into a technology, you should be able to get a patent in as much as that part of the technology is a result of your intention and design. Okay? No problem. So I think this works. I think this is actually somehow what the courts are doing. I don't think they recognize it, and they haven't formulated it in a way that's very philosophically satisfying. But I'm hoping that in the future it will become more clear and more logical. And I think we're heading in the right direction. So thank you all for your attention, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Sí. Muy bien. Tenemos tiempo para algunas preguntas, comentarios, no sé si... I have a question.
Yes.
We have talked about this before. Now you have gave us an explanation of what will be a logical or philosophical way of defining whether something is patentable or not. But what we're talking about here is the outcome of a research project. It's the outcome of scientific knowledge. So the first question will be when and how it became that we switch the objective of science, and instead of making scientific knowledge a public mean for everyone to use for the benefit of society, we switched it and we saw the product of science as something that you can make profit out of, and companies are now being the main founders and the main decision makers where science needs to go.
Right, so one of the unspoken hidden agendas of this talk is to describe how we can sort of maintain a bulwark, right? Maintain a boundary for public science. Because the discoveries of laws of nature and products of nature and abstract ideas by philosophers all belong to everybody under this theory. And there's also an ethical argument which I haven't made, because this is all ontological and legal, that says the same way that you and I have an ethical right to our private property, the public in general has an ethical right to public property. So all of the scientific commons that came in the second part of my talk ought not ethically to be enclosed. And one of the reasons I mentioned early on in my talk that all the research centers that were looking for this gene were receiving public funds is because we contributed to their profitability in the first instance by funding that public research. So it's an excellent question, and this is a larger problem than just this case. But it's our duty, I think, to maintain the public's right to access to that scientific commons. And we also happen to have paid for it. Okay, so this is a battle. The historical reasons why this has happened are, I could do a whole other talk on that. But we know what happened in the 80s in the United States as budget deficits caused, or claims of budget deficits caused withholding of funds from public science and the introduction of what we know as the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole Act, which was what allowed the University of Utah's Research Foundation to get a patent for publicly funded research. The idea was that companies would start to fund basic science. That was the idea. And the public ought not to pay for it because we had other things to do. So there is a long historical reason for what's happened and what is still happening. And this is happening in Europe, and I suppose in Latin America too, where governments faced with budget crises are cutting back in public science, basic research. And the way they're trying to make up for it is by encouraging business to invest by giving them a monopoly. I think that's a dangerous phenomenon. And I think it is taking something from us, both from our right to access to the scientific commons, and also to the possibility of and promise of blue sky research. Right? I think there is a general duty to engage in scientific research that may not have any profitability. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
And again, I could go on for a while. So. But it at least defines for us an ethical basis to maintain our right to that commons. Thank you. Any other questions?
When you speak about the things that can be owned,
Yeah.
what is the limit for establish this? Because there are different communities or different necessities of the people. So for me, can be some metaphysic, or I don't know, the life, the water. I know it's very difficult to establish the necessities for the different people, but there are there some, I don't know.
Are there limits or?
Yes, for establishing this topic, no, about the necessity.
So I'm going to fall back on a good old reliable Lockean notion of private property.
Okay.
So I think John Locke describes a good way to limit it.
Yeah.
If I tried to claim, because I could, possession of the whole world, right? Let's say I would say I have a very poor ethical basis for that claim, because I'm incapable of utilizing it to its optimal degree, right? So in nature, right? And this is the theory of homesteading, or that it's very common in, at least in Anglo-Saxon Western property law, to think in these terms. And in fact, in the United States, your right to own private property is limited by your ability to properly maintain it. So the theory of the commons, right, that I described earlier is actually applied in another way, in that I could go find a piece of land that some absentee landlord has not used well, homestead it, build a fence around it, maintain a garden there, etc., and take it by what we call in law adverse possession, and then become the proper owner. I think that reflects a Lockean mentality, that the proper owner is the person who can maintain that property to its optimal degree. So yeah, there are limits. And I don't have to describe them, because I think Locke did a pretty good job of it.
Thank you.
That's pretty interesting, because there's a lot of cases that what you own, whatever you possess, it doesn't usually represent that what you're going to use. It has become also like a means of power.
Mm-hmm.
The more you possess, the more powerful you are. It doesn't matter whether you use it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, but we still have this notion that, well, in the law there's also another saying, possession is 9/10 of the law. So this represents, I think, the sort of philosophical basis for proper possession that I described earlier. If, who's the fellow who owns Sanborn? Slim, right? Lisa, yeah, everything else. Has a Sanborn's that he abandons for some reason. He forgets he owns it, right? Leaves it lying around, and I step in and I start to manage it, right? And I make it a successful, profitable business. And he, because he forgot it existed, wasn't taking profits from it. Anyway, I could, under that theory, properly claim proper possession of that Sanborn's, or his wallet. Again, if he drops his wallet and there's no identification of it, and he leaves a couple billion pesos in it, and then he's deemed not a good owner. And under the law, that works in my favor, because now I'm the more proper possessor, right? You have to be careful about what you own. And this is because it's in your dominion. But yeah, obviously people with lots of money and power fight against that all the time. But still, the law recognizes that as a valid principle, an important one. I think it encourages optimal use of property.
I don't know if in Mexico that law applies.
Don't you have a finders keepers law? So if I find something lying in the street that has no indicia of ownership, nobody else comes and claims that, you get to keep it, right?
Yeah.
We call that finders keepers. And it's actually a legal principle, and it reflects this notion of being a good owner.
Do you think that the stronger solution for the problem you are mentioning is a law, or we have to think in other aspects?
Well, I am a lawyer and a philosopher, so I'm going to defend philosophy's role in helping us to understand the world. So the law has utilitarian ends. And sometimes I think those utilitarian ends conflict with reality, as in the case of gene patenting. So I will appeal to reality, to logic, to ontology, and to ethical principles that we hold commonly, as being sometimes the primary motivator for change and action. The law ought to, I think the law ought to reflect reality in some way. This is, by the way, not what we're taught in law school. In law school, the dominant theme is what we call legal positivism. And a legal positivist would claim that I can make the law do whatever I want it to do. The problem with that is taken to its logical extension. It would mean that I could declare by law that 2 + 2 = 5, and that would be the law, and there would be something just about it. Because for a legal positivist, justice is the law.
Yeah.
Now, the philosopher in me says there's something terribly wrong with that, and anybody who's read Orwell will understand why. So, any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.